getting really close to being able to conclude this series of lessons. Let's see, 8th, 15th, 22nd, 29. We've got 3 more weeks in, let's see, 15, 22, 29. So 3 weeks in December. And so I'll probably come up, well, we've got at least one more lesson to finish off the book, which will be next week. So for the 22nd and 29th, I'll probably come up with a couple of individual lessons, and then we will begin another series of lessons in January. This morning we're going to be looking at some of the more specific instructions that Paul gave to the Galatian Christians. I've entitled it Dealing with the Guilty. I don't know if that's entirely appropriate or entirely accurate, but these first 5 verses are interesting, and they have a couple of, or at least one really interesting question that I do not have the answer to. So I eagerly await your providing me with this very crucial answer. However, what I want to do to begin in this first paragraph, I think is so important and something that we don't typically think of when we look at the back half of several of Paul's letters. Galatians, Ephesians, Colossians, Philippians to a certain point, even 1st and 2nd Thessalonians to a certain point, although not as clearly in those letters as some of the other letters. Romans also. And that is, in the first half of these letters, Paul seems to be dealing with what we would consider to be theological stuff, doctrinal stuff. He's answering questions, or he's providing a specific teaching to his audience. And then in the second half of these letters, he turns to more specific applications. And what I fear happens, and I think in particular in this study in Galatians, it really hit me, is that when we look at the specific applications, we forget the first half of the book. And we forget the context of whatever the first half of that letter. He's gone to great deal to talk about doctrinal issues, theological issues, answering their questions, whatever it is that he feels like is the purpose of the letter. And then we turn to chapter 3, chapter 4, chapter 5, chapter 6, whatever. And then we say, oh, well, this is the application. And these are the do's and the do-nots, and the you shoulds and the you should nots. And we separate it completely from the first half of whatever letter that we're reading. So what has the context been in the letter to the Galatian disciples? What has he been spending the first 3.5 to 4 chapters discussing? What's the whole point?
Our relationship to God from the standpoint of heirship, things like that. That's how, in that context, his discussion is unfolding.
Okay. The primary question that Paul appears to be dealing with is, what is the Christian's relationship to the law of Moses? Do we have to accept and follow and abide by the Mosaic law in order to be a disciple of Christ? Or can we be a disciple of Christ, as particularly a Gentile, Can a Gentile be a disciple of Christ separate and apart from this law of Moses? That is his huge question. And he's worked through a number of different angles, number of different points that he has made. And if we forget that, then all of the you shoulds and the you should nots and the do's and the don'ts become just separate and just out there by themselves. And I think that's a huge mistake that we make. So he's discussing a desire and perhaps maybe a historic fact that some of these Galatian disciples have either lapsed back to their Judaism, or they're being forced to accept Judaism, or maybe, and this is a possibility that we don't think about a whole lot, but maybe they're going back to their pagan life, observing days and weeks and months and all of these laws that the various pagan religions were imposing on them. And so it may have been an idea that, well, yeah, I want to be a Christian. I want to be a disciple. I want to be a follower of Christ, but I want my old life too. I want my old religion too. And so the most immediate context leading into chapter 6 begins with chapter 5 and verse 16, and that is, but I say, walk by the Spirit. And so that entire paragraph with 5:16 and following down through the end of chapter 5 is, if we're not going to walk by the law, if we are going to walk by the Spirit, what does that look like? Well, we're going to put a whole bunch of stuff away, the works of the flesh, but we're going to add a whole bunch of other stuff, namely the fruit of the Spirit: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, self-control, all those good things. And then seemingly he adds a whole bunch of other instructions, but I want us to bear in mind this question: are these totally unrelated instructions, or are they still tied to chapters 1 through 5? Well, 1 through 4.5. And I think I've tipped my hand that I think he's really concerned about making these specific applications in relation to this whole question of the Jewish law. Okay, with that aside, let's go ahead and read then chapter 6, verses 1 through 5. And as I have looked at a number of different commentaries, sometimes the commentaries will stick verse 6 onto verses 1 through 5. Sometimes they stick verse 6 through in that paragraph 6 through 10. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to read verses 1 through 5 and view that as a separate paragraph. Somebody could read that for us.
Brothers and sisters, even if a person is caught in any wrongdoing, you who are spiritual are to restore such a person in a spirit of gentleness, each one looking to yourself, so that you are not tempted as well. Bear one another's burdens, and thereby fulfill the law of Christ. For if anyone thinks that he is something when he is nothing, he deceives himself. But each one must examine his own work, and then he will have reason for boasting. But to himself alone, and not to another. For each one will bear his own load.
Okay. Thank you. Appreciate that, Darren. Verse 1 provides us with a couple of questions. In fact, all these verses provide us with a few questions. The first one is, what does it mean to be caught? We use the verb caught in several different varieties of meanings. You can be caught as in something happens to you, you didn't plan it, you didn't want it. It's like that fly that gets caught in the spider's web. All right? Fly had no intention of getting caught in the spider web. Actually, would probably have preferred not to have been caught in the spider web, but that person is caught in a transgression. Something happens, there's a temptation, there is a momentary burst of anger or just a momentary lapse in our moral compass, and we get caught in this particular transgression. The other way in which we use the word caught, as in we're caught red-handed, we're nabbed. I enjoyed coming up with synonyms. We're found out, we're nabbed, we're pinched. That's a good old English. The English bobbies would pinch somebody, nabbing them. They were apprehended. Which, by the way, I heard a delightful little. Remember Paul Harvey's The Rest of the Story? Heard a delightful one this morning. This very influential, highfalutin lady back in the old country, merry old England, married to a colonel who really didn't want to be married to her. And he had a mistress. And he was getting ready to dump this somewhat affluent lady for this younger model, this mistress. Well, come to find out, the affluent lady found out about it. And so she decided that she was going to kill this guy. But she was not going to be the murderess. So she concocted this incredibly detailed story in which she would fake her own death. The British authorities, the English authorities would arrest the colonel because he had plenty of reason to do this, would arrest this colonel, and because they had the death penalty back then, he would be offed. And then after he was cold and gone and dead for several months, she would miraculously reappear with a story of what had happened to her. Well, she disappears and they contact him. Where were you? Well, I was at this big dinner party. What was the dinner party for? Well, I was getting ready to announce my engagement to this young lady. Well, did your wife know about it? Well, yeah, probably. We had a big fight about this and this and that and the other thing. And so he had no alibi. He had received a phone call during the middle of this dinner party and had to leave. And so that provided the window of opportunity for him to kill this lady. And they found her car down in this great big pit, and her coat was still in the car, and all this kind of evidence was there, and all of this kind of stuff. And so he was just inches away from being pinched. But she forgot one thing. She was so famous that there was no place in England that she could hide. And so clear across the country, she's out roaming the countryside, and all of a sudden people started recognizing her, because she was one of the most famous mystery writers of all time. Her name was Agatha Christie. Wow. And now you know the rest of the story. And so when I was thinking about this, all these words about being nabbed and pinched and apprehended. So what is Paul talking about here? Is he talking about someone who is just caught up in a transgression, caught up in a sin, even though they don't want to be? Or is he talking about somebody who was nabbed, caught, apprehended? Or does it matter?
The New King James uses the word overtaken. And so overtaken would be the caught up, not the net.
Yeah, that would be the fly in the spider web, overtaken by a transgression. Okay? Any other translation provide a little bit more? Okay, I don't know that it really matters that much, one way or the other. You're still guilty, and you're still found out. Somebody knows that you are guilty of that particular transgression. So, whether it was premeditated or unpremeditated, you're guilty.
Here, we're being given instructions to ourselves about what we should do about it. And I would submit that we do the same thing in either case of caught. We would do the same thing.
Yeah.
Our responsibilities in that situation would be virtually identical.
Yeah. We are dealing with someone who, whether they thought that they were getting away with it or not, it is now out in the open, or at least open to a few people. May not be widely known, but at least there are some. Now, going back to the contextual question, is he talking about, and the ESV says any transgression. I think a couple of the other translations I looked at, any trespass. The word any there. Is he going back to the idea that somebody is surreptitiously trying to placate, surreptitiously trying to get along with the Judaizers? Are they dividing the congregation by trying to do this? Or is he talking about any transgression from A to Z? You think it's just any transgression, trespass? It's interesting that he doesn't use the word sin here. So it's more of a...
NIV says sin.
NIV does say sin. Yeah, the Greek is more of transgression, trespass, violation of particular code, moral code. Yeah.
NASB has wrongdoing.
Wrongdoing. Okay. Yeah, it is.
Yeah, I've got to remember, it's humans, not God, who says this sin's okay, but that one's not, or missing the mark is missing the mark.
Our category of sins, yeah. He's throughout the letter. He is very, very concerned with a group of leaders, a group of individuals who are trying to, or have already, really caused a lot of division in the congregation, and he wants that to come to a stop. Stop doing that. So the transgressions could be related to that, or built on that, just any transgression. Whatever you have been caught in, or whatever anyone else has been caught in. I do think he has in mind, even if it is kind of a universal any transgression, I think he really does have in mind these other, because he's just listed a whole bunch. Okay, the back half of chapter 5, the works of the flesh. All right, he's just listed a whole bunch. And so he may be thinking about this list of works of the flesh that he's just enumerated for us. And that would make sense, because it's still a contextual reference.
When we think back to the idea that the Bible is consistent no matter which author wrote things. I'm thinking of the last sentence in the book of James. When you turn a sinner away from, and just saving their soul.
Right.
And James isn't categorizing.
Okay, second part there of verse 1, you who are spiritual should restore him in a spirit of gentleness. And I really didn't think about this until, once again, I was provided this list in one of the commentaries. To whom is he speaking? And the author gave 6 options, but I really think that option 6 is the same as option 1. And in fact, he basically admitted the same thing himself. So he's either referring to all Galatian disciples, and he's just using an umbrella term, you who are spiritual. That is, if you are in Christ, you are of the Spirit, and therefore you should be spiritual. Another thought that this particular author came up with is those who were responsible for, or those who caught the guilty party. In other words, someone or a group of people goes to this individual and they say, we see what you have done, we've heard what you have done, and we are here to restore you back to your relationship with God and the church, whatever. A third option, maybe a specific leadership group. Very, very closely related to that would be a group that Paul considered to be led by the Spirit, perhaps manifesting certain spiritual gifts, going back to like 1 Corinthians, maybe even Romans. A more oblique reference would be those who were led by the Spirit and not the law, which I think probably has some legs under it. He just said, walk by the Spirit. All right, don't walk by the law. If you were walking by the law and you found somebody that was guilty of a particular sin, what would you be led to do?
Depends on what the sin was.
Yeah, there would have to be some kind of punishment.
Yeah.
You know, there would have to be some kind of, all right, you're guilty of this, so either you have to pay, or an animal has to pay, or you have to bring, a grain offering or something like that. And Paul says, maybe we can get away from that. Maybe there are other ways to handle this, because if you're led by the Spirit, if you're walking by the Spirit, we don't have to, we put aside the law, right? And then the last one, which the author really identifies as very, very similar to the first one, is all disciples everywhere. This is a universal instruction, and so I think for us, we would fit into there. At least I would hope that we would be led by the Spirit and not legalistic, obeying some kind of law.
I think this is, maybe I'm wrong about this, but I think this is very interesting, and that it's moving us away from the law, from the standpoint that in the law, what you did determined the punishment. And so Paul here is using a totally different approach. Wrongdoing, caught in whatever, because under the new covenant, sin is sin.
Yeah.
It's sort of like the analogy of a chain with its links. One link goes, you're done. And so he's not saying, well, if you did this, then you got to do that. Back to under the old covenant, it's an if-then charge.
Yeah.
If you did this, then you got to do that. It's sort of like here it's saying, no, you were caught in a wrongdoing. Whether you accidentally did it or not, it doesn't matter. Not only that, but it doesn't matter what it was. And not only does it not matter to them who did it, it shouldn't matter to us. And I think that's a very powerful move away from the law, where you're having to keep track of all kinds of if-then charges.
If-then charges. And the other thing is, with the old law, if you did A, you had to pay with B. And then it was just a legal transaction. It was
Right.
done.
Transaction.
You got a speeding ticket, you paid, you moved on. This is, you commit a transgression, you have separated yourself not only from God, but from us, from the group. And so we are going to restore you. And that is a really interesting word, because he doesn't say restore you to God or restore you to the church. He just says restore you. Restore these people in a spirit of gentleness. So it's both and. You're bringing the person back to a proper relationship with God, but you're also bringing that person back into a proper relationship with the spiritual community. And we are to do this in a spirit of gentleness, because we're human too. And whether we could get caught in the exact same transgression doesn't matter. We too can get caught in a transgression. And so how do we want to be treated? Well, we would like to be restored. We would like to be brought back to God. We would like to be made one with the congregation again in a spirit of gentleness. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. So that's a whole bunch of talking for just one verse, but there's a whole lot in that one verse. Now, verse 2 is connected to verse 5, and I want to talk about that. But before we get to verse 5, Paul says to bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ. How do we bear another person's burden? He has just talked about restoring a person who has committed transgression. Is this burden related to the transgression? How do we do that? And if we're supposed to bear one another's burdens, does that totally erase our personal responsibility? Well, it's not my fault. You're supposed to carry me. If you don't carry me, then obviously I can't be guilty. All kinds of interesting questions.
I think the restore sounds like more like help them rehabilitate their lifestyle.
Okay.
So, and when we carry their burden, we're helping them stay away from whatever, helping them get through.
I think I like that answer. That we are bearing, not burying, we are bearing, we are helping them carry this load. We are helping them come back to the proper relationship that we feel like they have been separated from. Yes?
If you think about sin being something that's oppressing somebody, bearing that load is, helping to bear that load. What can I do as another person to help you avoid those challenges?
Okay. I like that answer as well. Not Corinthians. Paul says something very, very similar in the letter to the Romans. I have pointed out how the letter to Romans is very, very similar to Galatians. In chapter 15, the letter to the Romans, Paul has this. Chapter 15, verse 1, we who are strong have an obligation to bear with the failings of the weak and not to please ourselves. Let each of us please his neighbor for his good, to build him up. For Christ did not please himself, but it is written, the reproaches of those who have reproached you fell on me. So I think there is this sense here that Dennis has really pointed to is that if we know someone is struggling with a particular issue, we are to bear them up. We are to help carry them so that they don't get caught in that. I think of Alcoholics Anonymous. What is the entire purpose of Alcoholics Anonymous?
Support system.
It's a support system. It's a whole bunch of people who struggle with the same issue who are there for the exact purpose of helping other people get past their failings, their weaknesses, their struggles. Okay? So I like all of that. That's awesome. That's wonderful. Before we move on to verse 5, though, what is the law of Christ? I thought Paul just spent 4.5 chapters telling us, get away from the law, get away from the law, get away. And he throws in this law of Christ.
Well, you have the reference of Romans 13:8-10, and that's all about love one another.
As I mentioned a couple of lessons ago, I've slept since then, so I can't remember you have it. The definition of the word of. And it's interesting reading different commentators and how they view this. But one phrase really got my attention, and I like what the author said. He said that the law of Christ can be viewed as the law as interpreted by Christ, as exemplified by Christ. And so that led me then to go back to Matthew chapter 5 and verse 17. I have not come to abolish the law, but to what? Fulfill it. So everything that you see in me is what God really intended the law to look like. And this is what the Pharisees couldn't do. Jesus healed somebody on the Sabbath. Oh, you can't do that. You can't do that. We're supposed to rest on the Sabbath. And Jesus says, I thought the Sabbath was designed to set people free. And even animals were to be given rest. And so if somebody is burdened by this disease and I set them free, am I not doing exactly what my Father intended? So the Pharisees couldn't see that. And so I like that. The law of Christ as the law as interpreted by Christ, the law as exemplified by Christ, as lived out by Christ. Not that Christ brought a new law that we have a whole bunch of different boxes to check off, but that we're living the Mosaic law. We're seeing the Mosaic law as exemplified by Christ. Right?
I was going to say, echo back on your Alcoholics Anonymous comparison, and it's a really good one. We're talking about, in those meetings, there is a whole range of people that are there. Those beginning to try and work their way out of a deep, deep hole that they've made. Those that are transforming further and further away from that. And in fact, some who are there who have completed that transformation per se, you never do.
Right.
That have completed that and are there not for themselves, but for others. And when you look at what Christ asks of us, that's exactly the same thing. We all are somewhere along that path of transforming to be like Christ. Well, the next verses in 3 and others talk a little bit more about self-reliance.
Mm-hmm.
The same thing applies to self-reliance. Now, my grandfather pounded into me that I'm not grown up when I can take care of myself. He says that, no, not in the least. You've grown up when you can take care of yourself in such a way that you can help others.
Oh, okay.
That's when you've grown up. And I think that whole thing about self-reliance, whether it is whatever, self-reliance, we are on that same long curve.
That continuum.
And, some people are helpless, hopeless, and hapless. Some people have it but only worry about themselves. some people are further along that transformation that Christ has asked for, and that is able to take care of themselves and others. And so I look at this as a really, really rich part of the lesson.
Yeah, and very often we get to these sections and it's kind of like, oh, read this verse and then move on, and read this verse and move on, and read this verse. Man, we could spend so much time. And in fact, because you brought up verses 3 and 4, which seem to be, we need to read 3 and 4 together. Paul talks about testing ourselves, self-examination. When you think of the word test, there are two really distinct definitions or meanings to the word test. Think of how what is the quickest word that comes to our mind when we hear the word test? What do we think of? An examination, okay? Have you learned what you're supposed to learn? Okay? But what does a metallurgist do when he tests a particular piece of gold or silver, whatever?
Just wants it to know what it was.
Well, maybe not destroy it, but for the purpose of purifying it, he's going to get rid of all the impurities. That's a really neat thought here, that when we look at that word test, that we are to examine ourselves. Do we pass the test? But also to test ourselves in the sense of purifying ourselves so that we don't get caught in the same transgression, and that we are doing this. I know a lot of individuals who are more than willing to point out somebody else's fault. And they just enjoy it to the hilt. They are the heretic detectors of the world. And they go through the world with a fine-tooth comb to figure out who's committing heresy. Paul says, that's not your job. Examine yourself, get yourself right. Jesus would say, or Jesus did say, take the plank out of your eye before you start trying to remove the speck out of somebody else's eye. And so examine yourself, test yourself, but also purify yourself. Make sure when you go to that person, you're going to that person with the correct motive and the correct idea. And then verse 5. He just said that we are to bear each other's burdens. And then he gets down into verse 5. How does verse 5, for each will have to bear his own load, how does that compare to verse 2? Because I don't have an answer, folks. I know it would be wonderful if I could stand up here and say that I understand every verse of every lesson that I have ever taught. That would be a bald-faced lie.
Well, I think that what he's saying is you still have to take ownership of your wrongdoings, but it's okay to let others help you pick yourself up.
Okay, I like that. That we all need help, even though when we get down to the bottom line, we're still responsible for our own behavior, our own shortcomings. I like that.
It also reflects back on, well, what is each individual's load? Have you been blessed in such a way that maybe your load may be beyond you?
Okay.
Your load may, in fact, require you to do other things. So I think there's a little bit of that as well.
I asked the question, are the burdens different? In the ESV, in verse 2, it's bear one another's burden. And verse 5, for each will have to bear his own load. There are two distinct words in the Greek. So whatever burden he's talking about in verse 2, he's either using a perfect synonym and he doesn't mean any difference between verse 2 and verse 5, or because he has chosen in a very short paragraph 2 distinct words that we do not have a real clairvoyant understanding of the difference in the meaning of a burden or a load. Any other thoughts about that particular? Okay, well, we will consider this paragraph discussed, but not fully digested, because there is just so much in this paragraph. Next week, I do want to get through the end of the letter, because really beginning with verse 11, it's a very personal concluding paragraph for the letter. So we'll spend a little bit of time on 6 through 10, but then we'll try to also wrap up the entire letter and make some concluding thoughts and applications about that. Anything else, any questions, thoughts, ideas before we break up? Okay, well, let's get ready for our worship service then and spend some time listening together.